If you like the ocean, stay tuned. 3 of the 5 books that I'll be reviewing today deal with something living in the ocean. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel Eclectic Reads. The reason why I don't do monthly wrap-ups is because sometimes it takes me more than a month to read even 5 books. But here we are, I have read 5 books spanning mystery, nonfiction, thriller, and even a classic. The first book that I finished was In a Midnight Wood by Ellen Hart. This is number 27 in the Jane Lawless series. Our sleuth is a lesbian private investigator named Jane Lawless. Apparently, she also has something to do with the restaurant business, but because this is the only book that I have read so far, there isn't a lot about food in this book. However, Jane is a host on a true crime podcast. She decides to visit Castle Rock, Minnesota, because she's interested in investigating a cold case, the disappearance of a 17-year-old boy named Sam Romilly in 1999. She also knows that her friend, Emma, used to date Sam, and they're about to have a high school reunion, so she thinks this is the perfect time to interview a bunch of people for the podcast. But while she's there, the remains of Sam are discovered in somebody else's burial plot. And so Dave Tamborski, who is the son of the officer who had investigated the case, reopens it and decides to try to figure out who it is who bumped him off. At the time, it was believed that Sam's father had done it because he was abusive. That was the rumors, was that he was abusive. But there was never enough evidence to convict him. And so Dave is trying to see if he can find evidence to convict Sam's father. First of all, just in case there's any questions, this is not a cozy mystery. We have a private investigator after all, but also the contents include homophobia in a small town, as well as a mention of rape. It's not described in detail, but it is a plot point. I really like the way that this book is structured. It's not always told from the perspective of Jane. Sometimes we're seeing things from the past in flashbacks, the perspective of Sam and Dave, who was Sam's classmate. And also in the present, we're following Jane, we'll be following Dave, and we'll also follow the perspectives of other people, Emma, who knew Sam. And I think it really worked very well. I feel like I really enjoy cold cases because that investigative element is front and center. You're having to revisit old interviews, conduct new interviews, pull up old papers. And I love that element because of my background in research. I thought it was very satisfying. I love Jane as a character. She does her job really well. But my favorite character is definitely Cordelia, whom I think is queer as well, though I don't know too much about her. Cordelia is so funny. She's kind of the comic relief in a mystery that is otherwise quite serious. She wears really extravagant clothing. I listened to this on audio, and I would actually recommend listening to it on audio. I think the narrator did a good job capturing each of the different voices, and I absolutely will be reading other books in this series. I don't think that I missed really very much starting on book 27. Of course, there's a whole backstory to Jane. Apparently, her previous partner had passed away and it was kind of a messy relationship, but that didn't take away from the mystery and I could follow it just fine. I gave this book 4 stars. The next book that I read was a reread, Moby-Dick by Herman Melville. I've always told people that this is one of my all-time favorite books, and rereading it, I can confirm that this is one of my 3 all-time favorite books, even though this time I gave it 4 stars instead of 5. This book I like to describe as a fantasia. In music, a fantasia is a mix of different musical genre, and that's really what Moby-Dick is. If you go into it hoping for a tightly plotted, straightforward narrative, you're going to be disappointed, and I think that's probably one of the reasons people are so disappointed when they read the book. We start by following Ishmael, or at least he tells us we should call him Ishmael. And he tells us about how he decides to join a whaling ship. Even though he had been on merchant ships before, being on a whaling ship is an entirely different experience. And he joins with this Polynesian named Queequeg. Now, the indigenous people in this story are very poorly represented and called derogatory things as well. But it also made me very interested in the role that indigenous people played in the whaling industry in the 19th century and before. I know that there's a few histories out there that talk about that, so I look forward to reading it. But going back to it being a Fantasia, we have parts that are told from Ishmael's perspective as he tells us about how he joined the whaling ship. But also there's encyclopedic elements. There are chapters that read like a stage play where there's like this dialogue. It will say Ahab and then whatever Ahab is saying, and then Starbuck, and this is what Starbuck says. Ahab, of course, is our captain. I did a whole video about Ahab's disability and how I think it motivated Ahab's behavior. So I will link that down below if you're interested. Ahab is joined by 3 mates. The first mate is Starbuck, who's only very important at the end of the book. The most prominent mate is the second mate, Stubb. He is someone I dislike. The way that he treats people he feels are less powerful than him is really off-putting. And he thinks that he's being funny, but it really rubs me the wrong way. But also for that reason, he is very interesting because I think he captures a certain dynamic on these ships. In addition to the play elements and the encyclopedic elements, there's of course the history of whaling, the biology of the whale, how the whales were used. I feel like this book is truly epic, not only in its length, but also in its scope, in the way that it captures a certain time period in American history. I feel like this really is a great American novel because I feel like I understand this world so well. When I first read this book, about, I would say 10 years ago now, I immediately picked up 2 books about whaling. The first was Away Offshore, which is about the Nantucket whaling industry, by Nathaniel Philbrick. And the second book was also by Nathaniel Philbrick, and this was Away Offshore, which is about the whale ship Essex, which inspired Moby-Dick. This time around, I was also inspired to pick up other books, and the book that I picked up was Meg by Steve Alten. So that's the next book I want to talk about. Initially, I wanted to read Jaws because I had seen Jaws and I really enjoyed it. I love Jurassic Park, Jurassic World, those kinds of books are so much fun. And I was interested in a book about sharks eating people. But Jaws is filled to the brim with racism and misogyny, and I just couldn't tolerate it. So after reading about 15 pages, I abandoned it and decided to try Meg instead. And there's much less of that in this book. So Meg is a science fiction based book that asks the question, does the Mariana Trench have a unique enough biome that a megalodon, a prehistoric shark, might still be living there with the deep sea vents? And in our book, we have a protagonist named Jonas. I think that's a very significant name, especially when you think about what happens later in the book, who was spooked some years before while he was in a submersible visiting the deep sea in the Mariana Trench. He believes that he had encountered a megalodon, a prehistoric great white shark. And so he surfaced the submersible way too quickly, killing 2 people, and he himself got really injured. He gives talks about the megalodon, really convinced that they do exist. And some people listen to him just because, they find it all very interesting, but he's generally dismissed in the scientific world. That is, until a scientist invites him to take yet another dive so that he can actually see the deep sea vents. They're trying to recover a technology that had basically broken down there. So the scientist is sending his son, and Jonas is going down in a separate submersible. When the son is attacked and then eaten by this megalodon, called Meg for short, and surfaces, now we have a megalodon on the loose. And this was the book that I was looking for. I mean, was it a literary masterpiece? Absolutely not. Were there people ripped to shreds and devoured by a shark? Yes, and that's exactly what I was going for. So if you like Jurassic Park, if you like Jaws, I definitely recommend Meg. I gave it 3 stars. The 4th book that I read was so nostalgic and this was Sammy Keys and the Skeleton Man by Wendelin Van Dronen. If you are a millennial, especially in the United States, you probably read a Sammy Keys novel when you were a child. And revisiting it was really so nostalgic because we have like 90s, early 2000s technology in this book. We have white pages and yellow pages and cassette tapes and high tops and all of this culture that would be familiar to us, but not so familiar, obviously, to children today. Sammy is a seventh grader. She lives with her grandmother in a retirement community. She's not supposed to be living there, so she's constantly trying to avoid a very busybody neighbor who suspects that Sammy is living with her grandmother but can't prove it. She also has a bully named Heather Costa. And so one plot line is her trying to get at Heather, who's like sabotaging her. But the other plot line is trying to figure out who was trying to murder a man who was living in a house that was believed to be haunted. So this story takes place around Halloween, actually during Halloween. And Sammy and her friends decide to ding dong ditch this house. But then Sammy starts smelling burning in the house, gets into the house, and finds this man tied up with a mask. And he has a trach, so he can't speak very easily. And Sammy tries to figure out who was trying to do him in. Initially, it's believed that it was a robbery, and actually, that's what the police think. The police doesn't like Sammy because of her getting involved in the first book. This is the second book in the series. But of course, she figures it out. There's a lot of things in the story that just wouldn't work. I also feel like Sammy is not always the most admirable character. I think that the way she handles different things aren't appropriate. And as a teacher, I definitely think that the way that the conflict between Sammy and Heather were handled by the teachers would not be how they would be handled today. For one thing, some of the things the principal does would break FERPA laws, which in the United States are laws surrounding the privacy of children in schools. But even so, I had a really good time. I listened to it in audio, and I look forward to reading all the rest in the series. I gave it 4 stars. And the final book I read was yet another book dealing with the ocean. This was a nonfiction book, Kings of Their Own Ocean, Tuna, Obsession, and the Future of Our Seas by Karen Pynchon. This book talks about the conservation of the Atlantic bluefin tuna and the policies surrounding its fishing. There's a lot of focus on Nova Scotia, where the author is from, and also on Al Anderson, who is a very difficult person. His personality, not so likable, but it is admirable what he did. He would tag and release these tuna to better understand them and their navigation. He also proved through his work that this invisible divide between two sides of the Atlantic was artificial, that there are tuna that cross the Atlantic all the time. There's also focus on this cult called the Unification Church that got very involved in the tuna fishing industry. Of course, Japan being the biggest buyer of tuna. But once sushi becomes this global phenomenon, we start seeing how Americans and Spaniards are having these huge fishing companies that are catching tuna and selling them, sometimes illegally. There's also a conflict in the book between two scientists, Carl Safina and Molly Lutkovich, and I thought that the author did a good job at not taking sides. It really deals with how science is used for policy. I think that what the book could have done better was focus on the human impact. It's something that I've been very recently interested in, especially when it comes to wildlife in Africa, because conservationists and NGOs can be very harmful in those regions. So I think that that could have been better. I just think in general, Al is not as captivating or as compelling a character as, say, Rick McIntyre, who is the focus of American Wolf by Nate Blakesley, which is one of my all-time favorite books on conservation. It's about the reintroduction of the American wolf into Yellowstone, and the hero of the story is Rick McIntyre, who is a ranger, and he's just definitely more of a compelling character than Al Anderson. I gave this book 3.5 stars. I think that if you're interested in tuna, there's just a lot there that will interest you. So these are all the books that I read. I am not done with reading books about the ocean. I feel like there's just so much there. It probably interests me more than space, just because it feels like you're studying aliens. The deep sea is something that we don't know very much about, and just the oceans in general. So I look forward to reading more about it. Let me know if you've read any of these books, or if there are books dealing with the ocean that you would recommend to me. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.